Good afternoon and welcome to today's Iowa City Foreign Relations Council program with guest speaker Dr. Monica Prasad. Thanks to Dr. Prasad and to everyone who is joining us in person and online today. I'm Bill Reisinger, professor of political science at the University of Iowa, a member of ICFRC's board, and I'll be host for today's program. We would like to acknowledge and thank our annual donors, sponsors, and partners for their support. The Iowa Arts Council through the Iowa Department of Cultural Affairs, Humanities Iowa, and the National Endowment for the Humanities, the University of Iowa's International Programs, Honors Program, Public Policy Center, and Center for Human Rights, the Stanley UI Foundation Support Organization, Midwest One Bank, and City Channel 4 for providing online access to all of ICFRC's programs along with the UI Library Archives. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Monica Prasad, who will answer the question, can social science help solve corruption? Following her presentation, we will have a few minutes for questions and answers. Dr. Prasad is professor of sociology and Weinberg College of Arts and Sciences Board of Visitors professor, as well as a fellow at the Institute of Public Policy Research at Northwestern University. Her areas of interest are political sociology, economic sociology, and comparative historical sociology. She's written 3 award-winning books using comparative and historical methods to examine the political economy of the United States and Europe. Dr. Prasad is currently conducting research on the economic consequences of market-oriented welfare policies in Europe. She's also examining state building and the development of meritocratic bureaucracies in contemporary developing countries. She received her PhD in sociology from the University of Chicago and has received the Fulbright Award, the National Science Foundation Early Career Development Award, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and several other grants and awards. Her new book, Problem Solving Sociology, is forthcoming from Oxford University Press. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Prasad.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you so much for inviting me, Bill and Catherine, and thank you to all of you who came out here on this winter's day, not quite what one was expecting. I also realized that I inflated the title inadvertently, so the title was supposed to be Can Social Science Help Solve Corruption, but we're going to be talking about solving it. We're going to do it today. All right, so I want to start by clarifying that I'm mostly going to be talking about corruption in developing countries. Of course, there is a lot of corruption in developed countries as well, but we're talking about corruption at a very different scale. We're basically talking about having to bribe someone in order to get a driver's license. That's the kind of thing that people experience in many developing countries, and that's what I'm focusing on today. When we talk about that kind of corruption, there are 2 dangers that I want to warn against. One is about moralizing the issue and about thinking that we are better than these other corrupt people. And to make that point, I want you to imagine that you have traveled somewhere, let's say to Egypt, and your child has gotten sick. And your hosts tell you that in this country, it is done to express gratitude to the doctor. You would immediately do that. You would do whatever they suggest that you do. You would pass money in an envelope because that's what is, it would be sort of unthinkable for you not to do that when your child's health is at stake. You would pay a bribe. In essence, this is basically what people are doing in other countries. Which is to say that this is not a problem of immoral individuals. It's an issue of the system. And that's what we're going to talk about. How do you think about changing systems? The other danger is in thinking that, we should be culturally relative. This is just how these people do things. We shouldn't impose Western norms. And sometimes you see that kind of thing discussed by people themselves. So in these developing countries. So President Suharto of Indonesia made this classic quote about corruption to a World Bank official. He said, "What you call corruption, I call family values." So his argument is that, well, okay, we're not actually behaving in these meritocratic ways, but we are taking care of our kin. We're taking care of our family. And you have to understand that this is just a separate value system. This is how we do things here. There is something to that, and I'll discuss that in a little bit, but I also want to make it clear that although we are talking about different systems, we are trying to avoid moralizing this, nevertheless, corruption has clear costs. It has very clear economic costs. There was this debate in the 50s and 60s about whether corruption actually greased the wheels and made things a little bit easier, but more recent research has shown that that isn't the case. In fact, corruption seems to lead to worse economic consequences for reasons that you can understand. You're going to be very hesitant about opening a business, for example, if you aren't sure what kinds of bribes you have to pay in order to keep the business. So you're just gonna you're gonna be more hesitant about economic activity in general. In other ways, there are costs. Marina Zaloznaya, who is one of the co-coordinators of this entire conference, is a collaborator of mine, and we have also shown that corruption seems to have an influence on raising infant mortality and decreasing life expectancy. So even just beyond the economic costs, there are social costs. Corruption increases inequality because the people who are able to access networks to pay bribes are usually more privileged than the people who aren't able to do so. And in fact, President Suharto said this is family values. Well, it's values for his family, as this slide suggests. So Rolls-Royce was accused of paying a $28 million bribe to Tommy Suharto, the president's son. So, family values, okay, this is great if you're part of the Suharto family, not so great if you're part of other families. So definitely this increase of inequality because of corruption. So for all of these reasons, there is outrage about corruption all over the world, including where it's very common, even where people pay bribes, even where everyone is used to this. They resent this. They are very angry about this. You see anti-corruption movements all over the world. So even if it is the way things are done in other countries, it's still necessary to do something about this. This is not a system that is optimal in any way. So I want to talk first about why corruption persists. If everyone's outraged about this, no one really wants to do this. Well, why is this the case? Why can't we kind of break out of this? So one of the first things is that corruption becomes necessary to participate in just everyday life in many countries. And one of the things that is really fascinating about the scholarship on corruption is how much the stories you hear in different parts of the world are similar. So, for example, you hear about people needing to participate in corrupt acts in order to access electricity or water. And you hear this in India, in Vietnam, in Mozambique, in Malawi, in Central Asia, in Uganda. Just pretty much all over the world, you hear this kind of thing. And one of the things that's interesting about it is that where corruption is necessary, corruption begins to be seen as a skill. People start to take a pride in their ability to do this kind of thing, in their ability to sort of manipulate connections in order to provide the things that they need for their family. Sometimes they even are very appreciative of politicians who are corrupt because it shows this kind of ability to transgress rules. So this all relates to the question of resources. There's terrific work on the electricity sector in many countries, for example, showing that because the electricity sector doesn't have the ability to provide uniformly, even just to get a little bit of electricity, you've got to participate in these corrupt exchanges. So one question is about resources. A second question is about definitions, what actually corruption is. So there is ambiguity over whether it's actually corruption or whether it's some sort of sentimental exchange of gifts. And you hear people often defending what they're doing in these terms. You know, they're outraged about corruption in general, but I gave a gift to the doctor because I was appreciative of how they helped me. Or I gave a gift to my professor because I was appreciative. And there are some really fascinating ethnographies about how this understanding works. There's one terrific ethnography of India by Craig Jeffrey. It shows that if a bribe is initiated by the rich toward the poor, it's understood as a gift. I'm just giving you a gift. But if the roles are reversed, if the poor initiate the bribe, then it's understood as a bribe. So the rich are allowed to give gifts in this way, the poor are not. So these kinds of confusing ambiguities over what exactly counts as corruption. There is also a question about what counts as public and what counts as private. Corruption is usually defined as the use of public resources for private gain. So you're doing something that should be available to everyone, but you're using it for your own private gain. And as I mentioned, there is outrage about this all over the world. Nevertheless, there is some confusion and some distinction over what actually counts as public and what counts as private. So what part of your office as an office holder, are you allowed to take pencils? Are you allowed to take the stationery, or are you allowed to actually receive gifts from people? So there's some confusion about that. And then the third thing is this question of competing moralities. So even though corruption is generally seen as immoral, in practice, other dimensions of morality can pressure civil servants into corrupt behavior, especially the morality of taking care of your own kin or your own ethnic networks. This can be very, very strong, very powerful. And you see this, again, in context as distinct as India, Nigeria, Uganda, South Africa. These alternative moralities, they are moralities about taking care of your family. Nevertheless, they also have a cost. You're taking care of your kin at the expense of people who do not have kin in government bureaucracies. So if you think about, in the example I started with, paying a bribe to the doctor so that the doctor takes care of your child, well, why is the doctor corrupt? Often it's because the salaries are so low that they can't actually make ends meet. Well, why are the salaries so low? Often it's because these are public healthcare systems and we can't manage to raise enough tax revenue because the tax collectors are corrupt. Well, why are the tax collectors corrupt? Well, often it's because they're privileging their own kin networks, there is this cost to these other kinship-based moralities. So to sum up why corruption persists, we can say that civil servants and ordinary people engage in everyday corrupt practices in order to navigate a broken system and avoid state neglect. First. Second, because the distinction between a corrupt act and a non-corrupt act is unclear. And third, in response to pressure from ethnic groups or kin groups. So these practices undermine anti-corruption reforms even when such reforms are very popular. So now I want to discuss several approaches to corruption and corruption reform, and especially why they have not been successful. Given what we know about why corruption persists, what are the reforms doing wrong? I will note that for about 20 years, we have been trying to fight corruption globally. There's all kinds of Transparency International is a big international non-government organization, USAID, the World Bank. There are all kinds of anti-corruption efforts underway and have been for 20 years. they have not necessarily been very successful. And so with this background in mind about why corruption persists, I want to examine these various approaches and suggest that there are some disadvantages and also some promising aspects of these. So the approach that underlines how these global anti-corruption efforts are currently designed is what is called thinking of corruption as a principal agent problem. Principal agent problems basically mean that if you hire someone to do some work for you, you are the principal and the other person is the agent, your agent, right? And how do you monitor this person to make sure that they actually do what they're supposed to do? That's the principal agent problem. If we think about corruption in this sense, well, I have hired a bureaucrat to do something for me, but in fact, they are taking bribes or not doing what they're supposed to be doing. That's the approach to corruption that we generally take in these anti-corruption efforts. And the response is very simple of this approach, which is that you monitor the agent, this should be the other way around, obviously. You punish the corrupt and you reward the non-corrupt agents. This is very much a ground level kind of approach to this question, an approach that highlights individuals. It's an approach that a lot of research, especially in economics, has adopted. It's easy to understand. It doesn't really seem to work. The main problem here is that this works as long as the people who are doing the monitoring, the people who are doing the rewarding, the people who are doing the punishing are not corrupt. So you bring in your international organization, you have your international aid workers there, you run your experiment and everything seems fine. You say, okay, this works. Let's go home. Let's publish our papers. Let's say we solved it, right? You go away. You leave it in the hands of local people, and the monitors themselves, the people who are doing the rewarding and the punishing themselves, sometimes end up being corrupt themselves. So, as we were saying, this is a question of the whole system itself. What people who criticize this approach argue is that, we say principal agent problem, but there aren't really principles here. It's not really clear who the non-corrupt principal would be, who would sort of back this approach. So there's been a lot of criticism of this approach. There is not currently a dominant alternative approach, but I'm going to show you two different ways of thinking about it that might be more promising. So rather than thinking about corruption as a principal agent problem, we can think about it as a collective action problem, which is a problem of the system as a whole. And so what people who adopt this approach argue, the method that they adopt is that they say, well, we do know that some countries have managed to reduce corruption, the developed countries in the West. And so they adopt a historical approach and they say, well, how did they do it? How did Denmark become non-corrupt? How did the US, how did levels of corruption fall? Which they did. Levels of corruption were much higher in the 19th century. They fell dramatically over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries. So what exactly happened? And one conclusion that these people are drawing is that because it's a problem of the system, you have to change the whole system all at once. And so they often talk about doing this in a big bang, specifically in some time of war or some time of economic crisis, when all kinds of things are in flux and when you could actually change several elements of the system at the same time. So this is a much more macro level. It's historically accurate in terms of how corruption has actually been solved. The difficulty here is, how do you manufacture a big bang? How do you turn this into a systematic approach to corruption? So that's the sort of that's the weakness of this approach. there are some suggestions about how to work with it. But let me just tell you about a third approach that I also want to talk about. And that's to think about corruption as an organizational level problem. So what the folks who make this argument point out is that you can never actually say that an entire country is corrupt, because corruption varies a lot within a country. So even in countries that are known for widespread corruption, there is usually some organization that is not corrupt. So as just some examples in the literature, so Kenya, there's a lot of corruption, but the Kenya Tea Development Authority has been known for being not corrupt since the 1960s. In Senegal, there's a lot of corruption, but the Ministry of Finance has a particular directorate that many people have written about that is not corrupt. In Ghana, there's the Policy Analysis and Research Division. In India, there's a lot of corruption, but the Indian Institutes of Technology are not corrupt. There's a lot of corruption in the higher education sector in India, but the IITs, you just cannot bribe a professor there. You cannot even think about it. I was saying last night it would be like trying to bribe a professor at the University of Iowa. No one thinks about it. And similarly, no one thinks about this kind of thing at the IIT. So there is a lot of interest in this kind of thing. As people point out, the variation in governance within states, within countries, is as large as the variation between states. This is a meso-level sort of strategy. Its strengths are that it's well demonstrated that what people call these islands of integrity. It's well demonstrated that these islands of integrity do exist, and they can spread. There are some weaknesses as well. First of all, there's no consensus on exactly how these organizations become successful. There are a lot of interesting hypotheses in the literature. Is it because members are exposed to other non-corrupt organizations? Is it because they've gone abroad and kind of seen how things can work? Is it because they have ties to networks outside the organization? Is it because powerful benefactors demand non-corrupt behavior? Or is it because the particular features of the market or the field? So all of these things are kind of unresolved right now. Another question is whether these organizations can ever be anything other than exceptional. It's not clear if they can actually spread. You know, you might say, well, it's easy enough to concentrate all your resources on one organization so that people don't have to, take bribes to make ends meet. But how can you do that across a whole society? So that is one problem. And a third issue that I've pointed to in some of my own work is that these organizations are sites of privilege. So it's often privileged people who get into them. So, for example, I mentioned the IITs. They are it's privileged students and privileged people who become students and privileged people who become faculty at these organizations, they often have just kind of startling ways of sort of holding themselves at a distance from their surrounding. And it's kind of interesting to think about, well, how do we think about how they hold themselves apart from their surroundings? On the one hand, perhaps you need this kind of distance from the surroundings in order to not get caught up in the corruption of your surroundings. On the other, it can be pretty unsavory. One of the things that I saw when I was doing research on the IITs, for example, is they keep themselves apart from the construction workers. So these are institutions that are literally surrounded by a very high physical wall to keep themselves apart from the city in which they are in. Construction workers have to come through the walls because some of them are new institutions that are being built. And so what happens then? And so there is this funny narrative that they have built around the dangerous construction worker. They say students should never go near the construction workers. So these construction workers are poor workers from the surroundings. And there is this sort of double world inside the walls of the IITs. In which the students and the faculty never go near the construction workers, and in fact kind of fear the construction workers. So these kinds of emotions of fear and distance are literally how we are preserving our non-corrupt organization. So you see the difficulty of this. We're kind of creating this privileged strata by having these kinds of islands of integrity. All right. So, what does this suggest about what to do and what not to do? So, first of all, what not to do. So, one thing that I think a lot of the literature led me to conclude is don't punish the bribe giver. So because corruption generates outrage all over the world, there are anti-corruption campaigns all over the world. And if you're following along with the rest of the conference, you see a lot of skepticism about these anti-corruption campaigns. One reason is that they often end up targeting the poor and catching the poor in dragnets because rich people can figure out, for example, how to use intermediaries to acquire what they need or to portray their exchanges as gifts. So anti-corruption campaigns and anti-corruption reforms have a lot of difficulties for this reason. We sort of have a stereotype of the rich driver of a BMW who pays off the traffic policeman, or a business owner who bribes fire inspectors. And that's part of it, but the ethnographic literature is pretty clear that bribe giving is often an attempt by citizens to meet legitimate needs, including in cases where they are actually entitled to the good or service that they're trying to get, but they can't get it without a bribe. So don't punish the bribe giver. Instead, there is an interesting suggestion in the literature that you should think about punishing only the bribe taker, partly because this separates the interest of bribe giver and bribe taker. The bribe giver now has an interest in reporting the bribe taker. So this is one thing that is being suggested. And then finally, so that's what not to do. So what do we actually do? So I said that each three of the approaches, the principal agent approach, the collective action approach, and the organizational approach, all of them have problems. But for a real anti-corruption reform, probably all of them are going to be necessary in some way. If we examine historical anti-corruption reforms and what has worked, the punish and reward part of it is important. It's important as one piece of a broader puzzle. The research, the question of the Big Bang, the collective action piece of it, that's also important. I said we don't know how to manufacture a Big Bang, and that's a bit of a limitation on that approach. Nevertheless, we can do things like examine what exactly needs to happen during the war or economic crisis, partly because there is often a war or economic crisis happening somewhere around the world. Ukraine, right now, there was this very strong anti-corruption effort even before the war. Now, during the war, it might be possible to sort of wipe the slate clean and sort of create the system anew whenever the current situation calms down a little bit. And so this research might lead you to, this perspective leads you to ask, well, what exactly needs to happen during the Big Bang? So this paper that I mentioned before with Marina, one of the things that we found is that is very central to effects of corruption on infant mortality was corruption in the judiciary and the police. So we examined various different sectors, corruption in tax agencies, corruption in courts and police, corruption in the public utilities, et cetera. And it was a surprise to me that it was actually judiciary and police that was important. I would have predicted the tax agencies, because then you can get revenue to build the state. But it kind of makes sense if you think about the judiciary and the police, if they are corrupt, then they allow corruption everywhere else. If the judiciary and the police are not corrupt, then they serve as a kind of backstop, so that you you have some sort of way of holding others accountable for corruption. So in terms of what needs to happen during the Big Bang, that's one possibility, is to think about the judiciary and the police and how do you control corruption there. And then finally, thinking about this third way of thinking about corruption as an organizational level problem. Obviously, we need to continue research on analyzing the causes of subnational variation in corruption. We need to think about how these organizations can diffuse. How do you create more such islands of integrity? How they interact with the corrupt field around them. And the piece of my research that I was talking about that suggests that these are creating privileged strata. I don't mean to say that we should therefore give up the idea of creating islands of integrity, but I think it is important to think about why others resist them. Why is the surrounding community perhaps not so supportive of these islands of integrity? Well, one reason is that they're not actually gaining anything from the islands of integrity. And so therefore, you have to give the surrounding community a stake in these anti-corruption reforms somehow. So then finally, to sum up, if you take away just a few things from this talk, I hope you take away the points that you can't really blame individuals here. That route is just not super helpful. Nevertheless, even though we want to kind of avoid moralizing this, there is a problem. It does lead to negative outcomes of various kinds. And so you have to think about this very hard and very difficult question about, well, how do you actually change an entire system? All right, thank you very much. And if there are questions, I'm happy to take them.
Well, that was great. Thank you very much, Monica. We now move to the question and answer portion of our program. For those of you here in the room, you can just raise your hand and a microphone will be brought to you. For those of you watching online, you can text your questions to 319-600-2588. That's 319-600-2588. And while we're waiting for questions, let me just once again thank all the members of ICFRC and our donors for their support. If you would like to join ICFRC or make a gift to support our programs, please go to icfrc.org. All right, and we have a question over here.
Thank you so much for your program. We at the Iowa City Foreign Relations Council have hosted a speakers panel of entrepreneurs and leaders who come from all over the continent of Africa through the State Department annually. And one of them, I remember, had mentioned that the move towards technology could be perhaps having a mitigating effect. He was talking about trying to get permits and how now the online application sort of took away this opportunity for bribes. And I'm just curious if you've seen that in your research or if you could comment a little bit about that.
Yeah, I have seen that. And there is some evidence that these kinds of digital surveillance sorts of things are reducing bribes. The one reason I'm a little bit hesitant to be completely optimistic about that is precisely because of this question of, well, who's doing the surveilling? Who's doing the monitoring? So there's an anthropologist named Jeffrey Witsoe who has some interesting research about one of these digital surveillance programs in India. And, so he actually got in there and he kind of embedded himself with the people. What he discovered is that they were keeping two sets of accounts. They were keeping offline accounts and online accounts. So the program seemed really spectacularly successful. And then they had their other books. So I don't want to be critical of all of these tools. All of these tools are definitely going to be part of the bigger picture. But I think the bigger picture is broader than something that can be done with a digital quick fix. So.
I have a question online asking, is there a correlation between the type of government, autocracy versus more democratic? It really varies in all kinds of ways. We see corruption in all kinds of regimes. There's some really interesting research that was just presented in the conference suggesting that the kind of anti-corruption movement you see varies in different ways. So in some cases, it's about corruption is blamed on economic policies, and therefore the anti-corruption reforms are seen as targeting those economic policies, whereas in other regimes, corruption is blamed on democratization, and therefore the anti-corruption reforms are seen as targeting the attempts to move towards a democracy. So this is a convoluted way of saying it's really complicated in different countries, but you do see it in autocracies as well as democracies. It's definitely not just something that you see in autocracies. You also see it in countries like India, which is a really well-established democracy. Thank you.
Maybe I'll use host privilege and ask a question. Monica, are you familiar at all with the case of the Republic of Georgia, which had a lot of success about 15 years ago in fighting police corruption in particular?
Yeah, and this is actually one of the cases that has been cited as a reason for thinking about this Big Bang approach, because it really was a sort of case of many things changing at one time. So there have been. So I don't want to say that the picture is completely negative. There have been some things that have been more positive, and some cases that we can find of anti-corruption reforms that have been more positive than others. One other piece that I found interesting at the conference was this suggestion that where you can actually hold the judiciary accountable, it actually is beneficial to political incumbents. So I found that was a little piece of optimism and hope in what people have been discussing at the conference. That if you are in power and you actually deliver on this anti-corruption message, well, maybe people actually reward you for that.
So another question here, what about the role of political leaders who are corrupt? And you started your talk, I think, with Suharto, and we might think about Putin right now, who's a corrupt leader.
Yeah, one distinction that I perhaps should have made at the outset is scholars talk about the difference between grand corruption and bureaucratic corruption. So grand corruption is this kind of corruption of leaders or business people in which there's some sort of exchange of kickbacks for patronage, something like that. Bureaucratic corruption is what I have mostly focused on. This is the kind of needing to pay a bribe to get your driver's license. The reason I focus on that is it seems that there are some mixed findings about grand corruption. It's interesting because it's this grand corruption, the leaders, et cetera, that really drives the outrage. But we do have examples of countries like South Korea, for example, which prospered despite quite a bit of corruption at that level. I mean, there's more research to be done on this, but so far, what it seems to me that it's actually this kind of petty bureaucratic corruption that is really the thing that we need to be examining right now.
Are there statistics on how people feel about corruption in these countries that are considered very corrupt?
There are, and everyone is always outraged by corruption. I'm not sure I know of any country where that is not the case. In fact, there is even this lovely ethnographic research that shows that even if you are in a country where the government has always been corrupt, like even if you have no experience with a non-corrupt government, you still have this expectation. You have like this ideal picture of a state and how a state should be. So and as I mentioned, there are nuances to this. There's variation in what's considered public, what's considered private. What exactly counts as corruption varies a little bit. Nevertheless, people are always outraged about corruption. And one of the things that we've also been discussing at the conference is the ways in which that outrage itself gets politicized and gets mobilized and perhaps serves interests that are not exactly related to reducing corruption. So
I'd be curious, everybody here in the room, have you all experienced corruption when you've been traveling overseas? Yeah. I mean, that was my overall experience when I was working in Russia. You certainly did not want to get stopped by the police, for example. So I think we all have had that experience too.
yeah, I mean, it's not uncommon. People often say, well, how can you study corruption? Don't people hide the extent of corruption? Well, often in these places, it's just so common that it's just what's done, so people don't hesitate to talk about it at all.
All right, so I think we will wrap up. So we now conclude our program, and I want to give a big thank you to Dr. Monica Prasad for her excellent presentation and for sharing her expertise with us today. Monica, I want to present you with a small gift from ICFRC. It is, pull it up here. Here's what we call the coveted ICFRC mug for coffee, tea, the beverage of your choice, etc. There you go. It'll come in handy right away. So let's please thank Monica Prasad again for her excellent presentation, and we are adjourned.